I was last in your midst about 10 years ago, 9 years ago at Metropolis, and that was fun. It's always great to speak to people who are really interested in history and immersed in it. And I say that as someone who taught history at the University of Kentucky, where, big surprise, sometimes the students were in there against their will. But it's great to see that, to talk about a subject and know that not only are you knowledgeable, but you have a vested interest in learning more about the past. My work on the Cherokees and the Trail of Tears actually began as a movie. That's not the usual genesis of a book, I must say. But back in 2006, I began researching and writing narration for a documentary film about the Cherokees and the Trail of Tears. You may know it. I hope you know it. It's called Trail of Tears, Cherokee Legacy. It starred the host and narrators were James Earl Jones and Cherokee film star Wes Studi. And in doing the research and conducting many of the interviews for the film, it occurred to me that the story I was uncovering did not square with what I had read about the Cherokees during removal. What I discovered was that there was a powerful drama over removal going on inside Cherokee country, just as corrosive and as revealing as the one that was dividing the country at large. It was a story of competing notions of patriotism and the future of the Cherokee Nation. Working on that film soon prompted thoughts on writing a narrative story about the Cherokee Odyssey during the removal of the 1830s, which is what this became. And so I thought what better way to contribute to a conversation about cultural conflict, which today we have so much of, than bring together my own internal conversation over two means of communication, film and written history, that I was using to try to convey what I saw was going on in America's ongoing struggle with its native peoples, most famously and most dramatically in the case of the Cherokees during the removal. Both film and history, in my opinion, invariably make judgments, especially on a topic that is steeped in moral and ethical issues like Indian removal. And the Trail of Tears is at heart an exercise in perspective, morality, the evaluation of sources and bias, and presentism, a fancy word historians use to talk about the power of the present moment in the life of the author and the nation when you're trying to interpret past events. To me, the Trail of Tears is a powerful and instructive episode of American history, but as I was soon to learn, powerful and instructive to whom and why. It matters greatly what lesson or insight you think you're finding and conveying, either in print or in film, and none of it is exactly objective reality, including this, even though some of you have already bought it. Too late. They just made it all up now. I began researching for both the film and the book as deeply as I could, delving into the period to try to find out everything from the 1800s to the removal in the late 30s. I looked at the subject from all sources, all sides, letters, diaries, newspaper articles. I looked at speeches, memoirs, and other things. The history I've come to believe can sometimes serve as a kind of therapy and healing, a force for holding up a mirror of our culture, to our culture and ourselves, a way to fight memory suppression, denial, and erasure. So let me start with my version of that mirror, my take on truth-telling and understanding. The Cherokees' tragic irony in the saga ironically begins, see if I can master this. There we go. It begins ironically on a hopeful note, really. Under Presidents George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, Indian policy aimed at peace and establishing a civilization program. A program that involved remaking Indians as red citizens of a white republic. Hunting and fur trading, the principal livelihood of most tribes, especially those in the southeast, would be replaced by the more civilizing occupation of raising crops and livestock. Abandonment of huge Indian hunting grounds for small farming plots would free up enormous tracts of Indian land that whites clearly coveted. Washington and Jefferson both contended that Indian life was uncivilized, not because of inherent inferiority, but because they'd not been yet able to imagine a better future for themselves and their children. Ignorance, not race, had made them uncivilized heathens. But with the right education and proper training, they could become respectable citizens in a fully assimilated, well, not to include black slaves, American society. To carry out the new National Indian Policy, federal agents were sent out as middlemen to protect Indian boundaries and to set up trading posts where Indians would exchange their furs and skins for seeds and hoes, horses and plows. Just as significantly, missionaries in the late 1790s began arriving in Indian country, armed with the religious values and domestic tools necessary for remaking Native Americans. Evangelical Protestants, Moravians, Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians all fanned out in Indian country, setting up schools and missions where Indian boys were taught to become farmers and artisans, and Indian girls learned to sew, weave, and cook. And most important, missionaries hoped to introduce Christianity, the telltale mark, whites believed, of a civilized people. Thus, Jefferson's Indian policy viewed all Indians who clung to their savage ways as hopeless nomadic hunters. Their game was becoming extinct, and their peoples demoralized and depopulated by war, liquor, and disease. Their only hope, he insisted, came from selling their lands, accepting white values, and becoming respectable yeoman farmers and U.S. citizens. This more positive, enlightened approach to Indian-white relations may have offered hope to Cherokees, but it was meant to feel like their last hope. It could not have been lost on the Cherokees or any other tribe subject to the civilization program that becoming civilized was their only alternative to destruction. It was against this ideological civilization backdrop that two of the most promising young men in the Sitting Cherokee Nation grew to maturity as acculturated Cherokees, John Ridge and Elias Boudinot. Cousins, John and Elias could not have better symbolized what the civilization program was all about. Boudinot's father and his white wife had left the town of Hiwassee after the American Revolution destroyed much of the region and moved to Uthacaloga near Rome, Georgia. There, along with brother Major Ridge, shot him up here. They cleared and fenced fields, built a log cabin, and planted orchards, just as the federal Indian agents had urged Cherokees to do. Life in the Uthacaloga Valley differed radically from what their families had experienced years before in Hiwassee. The communal clan-based village life had now been replaced by isolated, self-sufficient, patriarchal households. Determined to take advantage of the benefits of the civilization program, Boudinot's father in 1811 enrolled the 6-year-old Elias in the Moravian school at Spring Place Mission, east of present-day Chatsworth, Georgia. The same mission school his cousins John and Nancy Ridge, along with other Indian children, were attending. A Cherokee with a sensitive demeanor, Elias was from the beginning a remarkable, gifted student. Meanwhile, Boudinot's cousin John, under the ambitious guidance of his father, Major Ridge, who could neither speak nor read English, moved from Spring Place to the Brainerd Mission near Chattanooga, where he quickly developed a reputation as the best student at the school. A graceful, delicate, light-skinned Cherokee, John was a thoughtful young man with an inquiring spirit. In 1817, Elias and John were invited to continue their studies at a new school in Cornwall, Connecticut, set up by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. For their experiment in assimilating young Indians, the leading men of Cornwall could not have hand-selected better prospects than Boudinot and Ridge. They came from homes already exposed to the strong missionary effort in Indian country, and both young men were brilliant students intent on broadening their education and becoming as civilized as white culture would allow. At Cornwall, they may have intended a full and complete assimilation with white culture, but what they got was quite unexpected, and in the end, disastrous. While in school there, the young men fell in love with two prominent local white girls, and even more infamously, married them, much to the shock and anger of the entire Cornwall community. It was an anger that culminated in the couples being burned in effigy on the town square. The outrage in Cornwall, which John Demos has done a great job of exploring, The outrage there over the boys' interracial marriages served to disillusion Boudinot and Ridge about any dreams of assimilation with white America. For Boudinot, marrying Harriet Gold proved to be a true life-changing moment. Boudinot's intensely personal and humiliating encounter with white racism at Cornwall made a mockery of the idea that the two cultures could peacefully commingle. And the very heart of what the school at Cornwall stood for, that education and Christianity would foster equality between Indians and whites, now rang hollow. A few years before his controversial marriage, John Ridge had pridefully noted in a letter he sent to President Monroe in 1822, "My father and mother are both ignorant of the English language, but it is astonishing to see them exert all their power to have their children educated like the whites." The promise of Cornwall and the hopes of Boudinot and Ridge, like the effigies on the town square, had now gone up in flames. Dispirited and disillusioned, newlyweds John and Sarah Ridge and Elias and Harriet Boudinot returned home to Indian country in 1825. But nonetheless, they immersed themselves in trying to better the Cherokee people. John Ridge became a successful lawyer, while Elias took off on a lecture tour along the East Coast to make the case for Indian advancement, to raise funds for a national academy, and to establish a press and a printing office. And Boudinot soon became closely associated with this guy, who I hope you know, Samuel Worcester, a minister and expert linguist from Vermont. Boudinot and Worcester began a strong friendship there, grounded in a shared Christian faith and in an evangelical desire to improve the Cherokees. Drawing on the remarkable newly created syllabary of Sequoyah, the two men conceived of a new Cherokee newspaper that would be printed in both English and Cherokee. So work that out. It would publish laws of the Cherokee Nation as well as spread news about its people's progress in education, religion, and the literary arts. It was called, as you know, the Cherokee Phoenix. They set up shop for the newspaper in the new cosmopolitan Cherokee capital of New Echota in December of 1827. The Cherokee Phoenix, this is a bad picture, right? See it there a little bit. It was the first newspaper ever published by our Fort Indians and printed, at least in part, in the Indian language. The first issue in February 1828 contained excerpts in English and Cherokee from the just completed Cherokee Constitution, the Lord's Prayer, and an editorial by Boudinot. Recognizing that most whites still viewed all Indians, including the Cherokees, as little more than savages, Boudinot focused on the Indians' capacity for progress as justification for a real, hopeful future. There was abundant evidence, he claimed, that, quote, Indians with the proper advantages are as capable of improvement in mind as any other people. Boudinot's optimism, even as he declared it from the pages of the Phoenix, would soon become suspect. In fact, what proved more prophetic was the greed of their white neighbors. When a Cherokee boy discovered gold on Cherokee land in the summer of 1829, land-hungry Georgians invaded Indian country in droves. The Cherokees bitterly complained. Found the ugliest picture of Jackson I found. Sorry, not sorry. The Cherokees bitterly complained about this intrusion onto their homeland, but it quickly became obvious that the invading whites, aided and abetted by a president, this guy, who shared their conviction that Indians occupied lands that properly belonged to their white neighbors. These land-hungry settlers would relentlessly pressure the Cherokees to remove out west. The pressure hit the Cherokees not only externally from the federal government, through him and Georgians, but also from within. By the summer of 1832, a full-blown split emerged in Indian country over what had become known as the Cherokee question. Not only how to respond to the obvious lack of support from the federal government and Georgians' continuing encroachments, but also how to deal with the growing divisions within the Cherokee Nation itself. On one side of this huge divide stood this guy, John Ross, Chief John Ross, who was 1/8 Cherokee, looked like a white man, and required an interpreter to translate all his speeches into Cherokee. It was John Ross who insisted that the Cherokees must remain in their homeland at all costs, that removal must be resisted, and that anyone who endorsed, let alone participated in negotiating a removal treaty was, in effect, a traitor, an enemy to his people. You hear that phrase a lot these days. The great majority of the Cherokees, intent on staying in their homes, supported Ross's unrelenting stance of resistance to removal. A small but highly vocal portion of the Cherokee people, though, had come to believe that removal represented the only alternative to the nation's eventual degradation at the hands of what Boudinot called, quote, an overwhelming white population who, in their sovereign pleasure, considered the Cherokees as their inferiors. Boudinot, Major Ridge, John Ridge, along with a few other acculturated Cherokees, comprised the leadership of what became known as the Treaty Party, because of their willingness to negotiate a treaty, to immigrate to new lands out west, where they believed the Cherokees had the best chance to survive as a people. By the summer of 1832, an escalating war of words, grounded in the fierce conviction of both parties, swirled through Cherokee Nation. And much of that debate at this critical moment turned on the question, which is basically the subject of my book: what should a good patriot do for his people? Let's see if I got the right picture. No, it's just back to that. I thought I had both of them together. Chief John Ross and Elias Boudinot answered that question in wildly different, contradictory ways. Portraying himself as the steadfast protector of the homeland, Ross argued that members of the Treaty Party were, quote, a small minority opposed to the will of the people, who were attempting to sell out their sacred homeland without the authority to do so. Boudinot bitterly fought back against, quote, the elusive appearance of having a vast majority opposed to us. The only reason the Cherokee people sided with Ross, Boudinot said, was because their chief had not seen fit to speak honestly with them about the people, about the grave dangers that lay ahead if they resisted removal. Ross, Boudinot claimed, was deluding the people and preventing discussion and debate, leaving his people, quote, ignorant of their true condition. A large majority of the Cherokee people, Boudinot argued, would prefer to remove if the true state of their condition was properly made known to them. Far from being sowers of dissent, Boudinot and his friends insisted that they were the true friends of the Cherokee people, desperately seeking answers and a new strategy. We asked, we entreated, we implored, he wrote, but we were met at the very threshold as enemies of our country. Boudinot didn't hesitate to use his position as editor of the Cherokee Phoenix to openly debate the issue, but Ross, who viewed the paper as the official organ of the Cherokee Nation, would not tolerate such dissent. The Phoenix, Ross contended, should present only the positions voiced by the constituted authorities of the Cherokee people. Clearly fearing that white political leaders might look upon such internal public quarreling as an expression of weakness in the struggle to resist removal, Ross instructed Boudinot in the summer of 1832 to stop publishing dissenting opinions in his paper. Outraged at Ross's act of censorship, Boudinot resigned from the Phoenix. To stay on, Boudinot described in his final editorial, or declared, would place him in an unacceptable situation, quote, as embarrassing as it would be peculiar and delicate. I do conscientiously believe, he said, it to be the duty of every citizen to reflect upon the dangers with which we are surrounded, to view the darkness which seems to lie before our people, our prospects, and the evils with which we are threatened, to talk over all these matters. Only a free and friendly discussion among ourselves, he said, will lead to a clear sense of the will of the people. When Boudinot left the Phoenix, Ross still needed the paper to be out there to spread his anti-removal message, so he replaced Boudinot with his own brother-in-law, Elijah Hicks. Hicks wasted no time vilifying his predecessor. He promptly announced that Boudinot's resignation represented a loss that was, quote, but a drop in the bucket. After all, Hicks claimed Boudinot had become detached from the nation and, quote, was now no more a patriot. There's nothing in my resignation, Boudinot fired back, which shows a want of patriotic views and motives. My motives certainly were of the most patriotic kind. In one word, I may say that my patriotism consists in the love of the country and the love of the people. These are intimately connected, yet are not altogether inseparable. Boudinot's position could not have been plainer. The Cherokee people were facing a devastating loss. Better to relocate where they can survive as a people than stubbornly resist the inevitable and lose both their land and their soul. Our lands, he wrote, or a large portion of them, are about to be seized and taken from us. Now, as a friend of my people, I cannot say peace, peace, when there is no peace. I cannot ease their minds with any expectation of a calm when the vessel is already tossed to and fro and threatened to be shattered to pieces by an approaching tempest. And to continue the weather metaphor, John Ridge threw in this phrase: if a man sees a cloud charged with rain, thunder, and storm, and urges the people to take care, is that man to be hated or respected? The way Boudinot saw it, the Cherokees now faced a grim existential decision that held out but three choices: stay and fight for their lands against overwhelming odds, submit to an oppressive white population and suffer a moral death, or three, avoid the first two by removal. But with the majority of Cherokees remaining strongly attached to their homeland, Boudinot understood he was fighting an uphill battle and facing a harsh reality. And for Boudinot, that reality pointed to but one question: how was one to love one's country that was destined for destruction? Although we love the land of our fathers, he argued, we consider the lot of the exile immeasurably more to be preferred than a submission to oppressive laws and the inevitable ruin and degradation of the Cherokee people. Boudinot's challenge then to Ross ran deeper than simply speculating on the likely outcome of removal. An ardent Christian, Boudinot's convictions about the fate of his people were inextricably linked to highly moral values, values planted and nurtured as a young man when he, like Ridge, was under the influence of the white evangelicals. Since leaving Cornwall, Boudinot had been consumed with the idea that Cherokee's self-advancement hinged not simply on material progress, but on spiritual and moral improvement as well. So he was especially irked that Ross seemed to suggest that the Cherokees lived in prosperity and happiness, and that somehow the treaty advocates were now responsible for ruining that bucolic world. Most Cherokees, Boudinot believed, were suffering from everything from alcoholism to poverty to spiritual and moral despair. If Ross and his supporters would honestly face the truth about the moral condition of the Cherokees, they would discover a people desperately in need of a new start. Look at the mass, look at the entire population as it now is, Boudinot said, and say, can you see any indication of a progressing improvement, anything that can encourage a philanthropist? To Boudinot and the Ridges, remaining on the homeland not only denied their inevitable fate of forcible removal by the U.S. military, it also flew in the face of a powerful moral imperative. The Cherokee people, left surrounded by the debasing elements of white culture, confronted a future full of degradation and immorality. You will find an argument in every tippling shop in the country, Boudinot observed. You will find its cruel effects in the bloody tragedies that are frequently occurring, in the many convictions and executions for murders, and in the groans and tears of the widows and fatherless rendered homeless, naked, and hungry. A genuine patriot, claimed Boudinot, seeks to save his people's soul, not simply his land. And so for him and the Ridges, that meant resettling out west where the Cherokee people could reconstitute themselves in peace as a virtuous and prosperous nation. Ironically, as a side note, in choosing removal, Boudinot and Ridge put important distance between themselves and their missionary friends who had done so much for the Cherokee cause. Samuel Worcester, perhaps Boudinot's closest white friend, believed, like John Ross, that the 1835 Treaty of New Echota, initiated by Boudinot and others, was a mistake, and signing it was at best misguided. Other missionaries also criticized Boudinot for his position on the treaty, and once resettled in Oklahoma in 1939, pleaded with him to apologize for his error in advocating removal. If Boudinot and the Ridges relentlessly pursued the patriot call for removal out west where they believed moral renewal could be accomplished, Ross and the mass of the Cherokee people focused exclusively on protecting the homeland as the critical work of the true patriot. For his traitorous conduct, Ross tirelessly fought to find a way for his people to remain in their homes, to publicize the unfair plight of the Cherokees, and in the end to negotiate better financial terms for removal once it came. Keeping his people united and together, to be sure strictly under his own leadership, became Ross's unwavering goal. And in taking on the treaty party, Ross could point to the vast majority of Cherokees who supported him in resisting removal. Ross spoke for the many traditionalists among his supporters who, when he argued that removal would tear the Cherokee people from their ancient and intimate connections to ancestral mountains and streams. A loyal Cherokee, Ross insisted, would never trade away the homeland without tribal approval. But this, he claimed, was precisely what the signers of the New Echota Treaty had done. John Ross was just as acculturated as Boudinot and Ridge, but he understood and respected traditional Cherokees and refused to pressure them to change their beliefs and way of life. Where Boudinot saw removal as salvation, Ross viewed it as destroying a distinctive traditional Cherokee identity. It is true that most Cherokees did not rally behind the vision of Boudinot and the perspective of the Treaty Party. On the eve of removal, the Cherokee Nation continued to consist mainly of traditionalists who embraced clan government, subsistence agriculture, and shamans, and remained suspicious of the missionaries' Christianity and the white man's civilization. The Treaty Party's Cherokee Nation, in contrast, envisioned industrious farmers living in nuclear families, formally educated, dedicated to the principles of Christian faith and Republican government. Only a small portion of such a world, in fact, had developed in Cherokee country by the 1830s, giving rise to the notion that men like Boudinot and Ridge were tragic figures who surrendered their lives on behalf of an imaginary nation that did not yet exist. These clashing notions of patriotism that informed much of the War of Words and the removal crisis represented a colliding system of visions over the future of the Cherokee people. For Ross and his supporters, standing up against an oppressive federal government allied with greedy white settlers in the South was necessarily tied to saving the homeland and preserving traditional lifeways of the people. But for Boudinot and his friends, such a perspective falsely assumed that Cherokee society was in a sound and prosperous state before the crisis over removal. What distinguished the vision of the Treaty Party from Ross's party was not simply the choice of saving the people over the land, but the focus as well on what exactly needed saving. Where the Treaty Party saw a disturbing moral decline, Ross and his friends found comfort and security in maintaining these sacred ties to Cherokee traditions, to those mountains and streams of their homeland, that removal would be eradicated. For Ross, a good and faithful Cherokee was someone who protected the homeland. Without such a physical touchstone to tribal identity, the very essence of the Cherokee people would be destroyed. However faithfully Ross and his adherents defended these meaningful connections to the land, they paid far less attention to what would happen to the Cherokee people if they were to successfully resist removal and stay in the East. Overrun by white settlers and forced to live as subjects to the laws of Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, Cherokees would soon lose their distinctive identity amid assimilation into a white-dominated society. To Boudinot, such a fate was, quote, too revolting to think of. In that sense, the Treaty Party, especially Boudinot and Ridge, were calling attention to the importance of race and the need for a completely independent Cherokee nation. Thus, remaining in their homeland, where Cherokees would soon be inundated by a demonstrably corrupt and racist white world, quote, would only rivet the chains and fasten the manacles of their servitude and degradation. And such a vision for his people's future, Boudinot believed, led inevitably toward becoming extinct or merged in another race, more ignoble and more detested. May God preserve us from such a destiny. It was, of course, the tenacity of the Treaty Party that shaped the destiny of the Cherokee Nation in the struggle over removal. Boudinot and the Ridges had no way of knowing that removal would lead to a trail of tears that would cost 4,000 lives and enormous suffering. What they did know was that Georgia settlers were invading their country, evicting people from their homes, stealing property, and violently attacking anyone who resisted. Removal offered an alternative to these depredations, but it also produced the misery and death of the Trail of Tears, which would linger for generations. And as we all know, Boudinot and Ridge and Major Ridge all paid the ultimate price for their choice to remove, assassinated as they were in Oklahoma in June of 1839. And that choice was a fervently held vision that in the end, the moral as well as physical condition of their people mattered more than preserving their people's country. For his part, Ross lost the battle over removal, but his unflinching commitment to keeping his people together as a unified and sovereign nation still remain a powerful legacy of this defining moment in the Cherokee and American past. For the nation at large, the Trail of Tears offers a devastating commentary not only on white greed and power, but also the increasingly racialized world of Jacksonian America. By the 1830s, only white Americans, especially in the South, could lay claim to citizenship and racial entitlement. Property-owning, well-educated men and women of good character no longer constituted sufficient proof of worthiness for participation in the public realm. One had to be white. In dealing with both African Americans and Native Americans, Andrew Jackson and his Southern supporters practiced a form of racial exclusion that hinged on the belief in the permanent inferiority of all non-whites, black and Indian. Most northern whites either looked the other way or agreed with their southern brethren. Elias Boudinot and John Ridge discovered this painful reality behind civilization during their wrenching experience at Cornwall. And as the Trail of Tears tragically demonstrates, race remained the key social divide in public life, making much of America a white man's country. Let me conclude with something that's in my book. What do we think the Trail of Tears means today, both to those who have remained in the ancestral homeland and those who live in Oklahoma? The eastern band of the Cherokees primarily descends from the men and women in western North Carolina who, along with Solly and his rebellious fellow Cherokees, resisted removal during the roundup in 1838. To the roughly 8,000 Cherokees living in Cherokee, North Carolina, just south of the Smoky Mountains, the Trail of Tears represents a rending of the essential fabric of the Cherokee people. For those who witnessed an entire people violently ripped from their homeland, it signifies nothing less than an act of ethnic cleansing. Many Eastern Band Cherokees during the removal crisis and shortly afterwards believed that there was only one Cherokee nation composed solely of those who remained behind in their eastern home. Therefore, those who moved west in 38-39 were sometimes viewed as expatriates and possibly traitors. Cherokees who fell victim to the U.S. government's divide and conquer strategy and also as expatriates who fell victim to that divide and conquer strategy. Today, though, such harsh judgments have been replaced by a positive spirit of common origins as fellow Cherokees. And for these contemporary Cherokees, the primacy of place endures, at least in a spiritual sense. As one Western Cherokee put it, the Eastern and Western Cherokees are separated only by a short distance and a little time. When you are of a place, you are never separated from it. Today, the Cherokee Nation, with nearly 300,000 members worldwide and 70,000 within its borders in northeastern Oklahoma, is the second largest Indian tribe in the United States. For these Cherokees, as well as those of the Eastern Band, the Trail of Tears remains, among other things, a compelling object lesson in the abuse of power and overwhelming tyranny of greed. For one direct descendant of Chief John Ross, I got a chance to interview Gail Ross, the trail still reverberates today with anger. Quote, "It is a story of a people who did everything in their power to assert their rights, and still it came to nothing in the face of greed." And that's an important lesson. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the trail is one of survival and hope. As indicated by, I think, one of the most interesting people I got to meet, the Eastern Band Cherokee storyteller Freeman Howell. He noted that this was a time that people survived insurmountable odds and still remain on this earth today. And this gives a great deal of pride to people who know that their families have gone through such a terrible ordeal. The adaptability and resilience of the Cherokees are revealed in their successful embrace of the Cherokee program, the civilization program, their unique and intellectual cultural accomplishments thanks to Sequoyah Syllabary, Boudinot's work with the Cherokee Phoenix, their democratic constitution of 1827, modeled on the U.S. Constitution, and most notably, their ability to endure the tragic, wrenching experience of the Trail of Tears, in which they lost 1/4 of their people, all of which have become, in the generations since removal, powerful sources of strength and confidence. Again, as Gail Ross put it aptly, we have survived a lot as a people, but we are still here. We are still Cherokee. We have kept the flame burning. Thank you. I'm glad to take questions. I'm not sure I can answer them, but I'll take them. Anybody has questions? Yeah.
I do. You made a comment that the Ridge Party had no way of knowing that the Trail of Tears would result. I know we can only think because we weren't in their minds at the time. But what did they think would result? Everybody would just happily...
Oh, not happily. Other people who moved out west before then, they did not imagine this kind of loss and degradation. I don't think they knew that. They knew it would be emotional, at minimum, emotional despair of profound proportions. And just talking about the death and misery on the trail, I think it's unfair to assume that they had to know that, like everybody saw that coming. I don't think they did. And that's just you're right. I'm projecting something that I'm assuming is at least plausible, but it may not be. Everybody's got documentary evidence or other perspectives. I'm open to it. Yeah,
Once gold was discovered in Georgia, removal was inevitable.
I think I can't get any argument from me on that. You know, greed is one of the most powerful motivators in the world. And when you've got finding gold and you see Indians sitting on the land, you're a Georgia settler, you don't have to do the math. It's right there. Yeah, that's a massive turning point in the whole story. Even though, you know, there were legal things that had to be gotten around, but a matter of time and how they did it. Witness, you know, the decision, you know, that Jackson didn't bother with the Supreme Court decision about Worcester and those guys. It didn't matter, like I said. John Marshall's made his opinion clear, but let's see him enforce it. And that may be a legendary comment, but he acted as if that's exactly what he said. Any other questions, comments, new perspectives? I probably didn't tell you anything you didn't know, but it was useful for me to put together this book and tell the story as I saw it. And I tried to be as balanced as I could because my, probably came across my heart was a little bit more with the Boudinot and Ridge faction, but they were obviously wrong about, in terms of having the will of the people behind them because they didn't. Yeah.
Which group became known as the Pins?
The what?
The Pins, I understand from some things that I've read, that it was either the treaty party or the ones that against them. Once they came out into Oklahoma, would wear a pin as a sign.
Oh,
That's
many
Civil
things
War.
I don't know.
That's Civil War.
Civil War era, okay. That's way out of my era, but it's a good question. I mean, I didn't know that. That's good to know. There's a whole another story, thankfully not as tragic as this, that goes on during the Civil War. Not to mention the 20th century. Yeah.
There was some indication that John Ross and his brother profited from
Yes. I was about to suggest that word, yeah.
profited from their taking over the removal. Since you wrote the book, have you found any proof one way or the other?
I don't know if some of you folks who stay in the world of Cherokee research more avidly than I do. Since I wrote this a few years ago, there may be other articles that have come out. My understanding was that fell into the category of plausibly the case. There's certainly circumstantial evidence of correspondence with Lewis and John Ross that indicated that they were paying close attention to how much money was being made. Now, to say they were animated mainly by that, I think would be wrong, but you know, that was always the problem with John Ross, at least for his detractors, was that the guy was rich as Croesus, and he spent a lot of time making sure he stayed that way. But I don't know that I cannot answer your question with the definitive evidence. As Rowena, weren't you telling me that somebody's done some work on the cost of the trail? Is it
Claudia.
Claudia Song?
Yeah.
Is that book out, or are you just working on it?
Jack, I've seen an article. There's an article in the American Historical Review or in the OAH right now. And I have just skimmed it, but it's in a very prominent,
Okay.
you know,
Well, Claudio Salt's a great historian, so if he's, I would defer to him completely on that subject if he's looking at the pecuniary aspects of the trail experience. Yeah, that's a very good question.
War Department records is where you'll find the contracts
Yeah.
that Ross and his brother made
Mhm.
to do the water route,
Yes.
which is the one course that comes right back here,
Yes.
and there was profit made.
No doubt there's profit made. I just don't know the overall picture and, you know, if they're, how much they're thinking about the profit motive as opposed to, okay, profits were made, but that's different from saying the decisions they made were animated by a desire for profit. I mean, you can, but I think there's a pretty good circumstantial case that they wanted to make sure. And I mean, part of it was they wanted to get as much money out of the deal from the federal government as they could, but drilling down into how much goes into the pockets of John and Lewis Ross is a separate matter. Yeah.
In the records, it shows what the Bell route came from Memphis
Mhm.
what it costs on a daily basis.
Yep.
Or after they're there, what we pay to them compared to the cost. It's a big difference, as far as the daily expense.
That's interesting, I didn't know that, okay. I mean, I think I would, until I hear more from Claudio or whoever else is working on this, I would still place some hope and some confidence in the idea that what the Rosses were doing, in addition to making sure that the removal went as smoothly, if you can call it that, as possible. But I think they were very much interested in the money-making part of it. You can see that in the detail. These guys, he's a merchant, among other things. He knew how to make money, and this was a big operation. So money was there to be made. It didn't really make him a bad person unless it turns out that, as I think he sometimes did, that he was prioritizing that over other aspects. Any other questions, comments? Well, thank you for being such a thoughtful and attentive audience. I enjoyed talking with you, and I hope I didn't put you to sleep.